a live audience in a way directly to them. But let's make the best of it. I'm going to talk about the dancing bees. That's the famous image of the waggle dance, which Carl von Frisch announced to the world in 1946, that foraging honeybees, a very small insect, can communicate direction and distance to fellow workers by means of the dance. It's the second most complicated language in nature, second to our own, and it's one of the top wonders of animal behavior, basically. And it's now, dance communication is now part of nearly every introductory biology text, in fact. And von Frisch was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1973 for his work specifically on this, although he worked on many other things as well. So there's the great man in the center there, and that's a summary of what I am going to talk about today. So how he discovered the dance, his background and the method that he used. And then we had the errors. He made some errors, and we have a controversy because two scientists in California challenged the whole hypothesis of the waggle dance, insisting it was based on the scent of the forage alone. And then we'll look at how the dance works and how it's interpreted. And we'll look at the theories of the evolution of the dance. Some of that, of course, is conjecture, because it's difficult to interpret how these things actually change from one species of bee to another, and how one type does it and another type does it. And then talk about house hunting, because obviously bees on the face of a swarm are actually dancing to indicate a potential new home, and that's the work that was done by Martin Lindauer, a PhD student of Carl von Frisch. And then I thought we'd just have a look at the end about some of the benefits from the waggle dance, some of the work that some scientists have done that give a practical solution and aid lots of people in how pollination is achieved. Okay, so discovering the dance language, you always go back to Aristotle because he wrote a book, and a large part of it is devoted to honeybees, and he was the first to record the ability of honeybee to recruit foragers to a source of food. One thing he got very correct was flower constancy behavior, and one thing he got wrong was he guessed the forager led the recruits from the hive to the flower, but he noticed that each bee on a return from a flower is actually followed by 3 or 4 companions. He would have probably noticed this in a crude observation hive, but he didn't actually realize that it was dancing for forage, and he didn't realize that the honeybee was recruiting other bees. And then, using an observation hive in 1823, Unlock discovered the dance, but failed to notice it was performed by returning foragers again and served as a recruitment. On the Maeterlinck reference, he thought that the recruits did not follow the original forager but came independently. So he was researching his book, and that's what he discovered. But it was Carl von Frisch who was actually working. He was in the Zoological Institute in Munich. He was studying zoology. He was a sort of failed doctor. He originally wanted to be a doctor, but he ended up doing zoology. And in 1919, while he was researching bees' sense of color, he noticed the dances, mysterious dances. Of course, that was important discovery because at the time it was only thought that humans could see in color, and he proved that bees also could see in color, and he also proved what they could see and the extension of their vision. But he noticed these dances, and that started 50 years of research into the language. In the Second World War, his position and life was in danger because of his Jewish maternal grandmother, and also because he actually looked after Jewish students and cared for them and made sure that they were made safe. But his own life was in danger but he got some good friends and influential people that helped to preserve his status. And also he was in a way fortunate in that in Germany at the time, the bee population was suffering from what's called Nosema plague, and it threatened to devastate the German bee population. And of course, that would have been devastating with no pollination for their crops in the war. He was in the University of Munich until it was badly damaged by bombing in 1944, and then he went to his wife's house in Lower Austria. And he published his theory in Dancing Bees in 1927, which is a sort of shortened version of the tome that he published later when he'd actually done so much experiments and explained them. Very, very detailed book. That's the picture taken in 1973 when he was awarded a Nobel Prize. And you must remember that when he first discovered it, he was very, very careful, especially he didn't use the word language unless he put it in inverted commas. And also it was almost unbelievable that an insect could actually communicate direction and distance as the only insect to do it. Because other types of solitary bees, stingless bees, bumblebees, they race around in an active way when they've discovered, but they don't give any direction and they don't give any distance. So this is the methodology that he used. He marked his bees because he only had shellac. We're talking about in the war. It was very difficult to get it. They used 5 colors, and as you can see on the, he put 2 marks basically on the thorax, from 1 to 5, and then from 6 to 0. And then he put a mark on the abdomen here and here, which will give him numbers then up to 599, which for the benefit of his work was fine. My computer, I don't know whether you can hear it, my computer fan is going like mad, which is unusual, but there we are. So his method was to erect a plank outside the hive and then put sugar water in and train a bee to go to the feeder, mark it, return, and then the next bee that came, he would actually move the feeder about, he reckoned, about 25% further away. And the follower would then, any marked bee would be removed and a follower, so that he could always get a new bee going along. And eventually at the end of the plank, he put it on a tripod and he got it out to quite a reasonable distance, not a very large distance. I mean, later scientists have actually gone out to about 13 kilometers using this type of method. But he also discovered, which was an interesting fact, might be quite an interesting about marking queens. He using shellac, and he was marking bees that were just emerging, and he found that they were being removed as damaged bees by the older bees, by the nurse bees. And so what he had to do, he discovered that they realized that the scent was wrong. So he let the shellac dry and then put a little bit of nectar on it. And then they were accepted. So that was a wonderful discovery that he made. So again, on methodology, he trained them to a training site, for instance, here, and then set up 5 other to just check where they were going to. And the majority of them went to, most of them in line. Some of these went off direction and some went the other direction, because not all the bees can successfully follow a waggle dance. There are it's quite a large percentage that actually get lost of new bees, naive bees. Only about 60% of them are really very successful. So it's not, 100%. On this, we show the error that when the bees are dancing for food, which is about 80% distant from the sun direction, and I'll explain those in a moment, we get an error margin of that way and this way, but the bees seem to know how to compensate for it. It's all about the going round in a figure of 8 and getting slightly off center as they go through the run, and the bees seem to average it out and generally go in the right direction. But of course, for forage, if it's large fields, it doesn't have to be that accurate, as long as it's generally in the right direction. Another experiment here was to understand whether bees could actually describe elevation. Could they dance for elevation? So he put a feeder on top of the bridge and trained them to go there, and then found that they were actually flying here approximately underneath the bridge, and he couldn't actually train them to go and actually get the forage. And in this one, this was a building where the hive was here and the feeding station here. So the bees actually initially flew all the way around the building, but they flew, when they actually did the waggle dance, they actually did the waggle dance for a straight line between the hive and the building. Excuse me, go back, between the hive and the building. So the bees subsequently that followed actually went over the top of the building. So that's quite an interesting one of the interpretation. Instead of going round, they take the shorter distance. How they do that, I don't think he ever understood that, but it was an interesting experiment. So this was a round versus waggle dance. So we refer to round dances and waggle dances. Now, this is where he made a mistake, because he was always training bees by giving them sugar syrup. And he never went too far beyond perhaps the limit where a round dance becomes automatically or becomes a waggle dance. And so he thought that all round dances were for nectar. And then he observed bees coming back with pollen loads, and he noticed that they were doing a waggle dance. So he thought that waggle dance was for pollen and a round dance was for nectar. And that persisted for about 2 decades. It wasn't until about 1943, one of his students actually found the error and corrected it, basically. And so we do have a round and a waggle dance, although that has changed somewhat now, because subsequent research by Catherine Gardner in 2008, where they've analyzed a considerable number of bees more accurately, they've discovered that there is a bias towards there is an indication in the dance, even at 10 meters. It's not that accurate, but as it goes on, across 50 meters, 70 meters, 100 meters, it's getting more accurate. And it's probably accurate enough for finding, because the bees go out and search. 500 meters, it needs to be obviously more accurate, because we're getting into that area there where when they are dancing on the face of a swarm and they want to indicate a potential new home, they've got to be a lot more accurate than they would be if it's for forage. Because these authors suggested that we should now call it an adjustable waggle dance, but I think that anybody who's preparing to do module 6, honeybee behavior, they should stick to the convention published in most books, but probably to get an extra mark if they quoted this paper, because it does give an indication at most distances. So now let's talk about the controversy, which was really set up almost by himself, because in March in London, March 1937 in London, he indicated that the recruitment of naive bees to food sources was a matter of odor, and it succeeded with all flowers except those without scent. So he set himself up. At that stage, he thought odor was quite important. And then when he published the dances of the honeybees in 1946, subsequent experiments convinced him that odor was far less important. So he changed his mind, which is, I mean, a privilege of everybody when you do more research. And but it did set him up to be criticized, basically. And two scientists from California, Adrian Wenner and Patrick Wells, they attacked him on these 4 points: that the existence of the dance proved nothing really, and that his experiments were not well designed, that well-controlled experiments that they did contradicted the language thesis or hypothesis altogether, and they came up with the hypothesis on that it was really down to odor and not to the dancing. Now, there were a huge acrimonious dialogue between Wenner and von Frisch for many years, and it wasn't resolved until the mid-1970s. But most scientists are now convinced of the bee language, and it was James and Carol Gould who repeated many of von Frisch's experiments and proved him correct, and that the odor theory was incorrect. Basically, that the Californian scientists had made an incorrect assumption that if they used odor on one occasion, they must always use it. And also the odor in a hive can confuse bees because you've got multiple odors coming in consistently from different bees on different forage. As we know, that they forage on many different sources at one time. We know that during a dance, a follower bee will actually make a sound like a wheep, and it will stop the waggle dancer, who then offers a sample of nectar. That enhances the how good the supply is, what's the sugar content, etc., of the source of the crop that's coming in, and that helps to reinforce it. And an experiment was done. A robot bee was actually made to test the theory, and because it offered no sample, the bees attempted to sting it. So now it's been proved that scent can reactivate navigational memories. So I guess if you have a field of something that goes over and we get it here because of our difference in altitude. Another one comes in, the scent can reactivate, and they can go out and look, but in our case, it might be in a different location, of course. Because honeybees are actually very reluctant to give up a food source. It takes a lot for them to actually cease a source of food. But that controversy has virtually gone away now. You don't hear this anymore, and the Goulds really, I think, stopped it because barnfish got a lot of support. So let's go briefly through how the actual dance works. We have here the bees are in a tree, and they will be dancing on a vertical comb in the dark. So going up the comb is always the direction of the sun. So when they dance at, in this case, 40 degrees to the right of the sun, and on the comb it would look like that, they would be dancing in that direction, and they're going round and back and round and so on. So that would indicate the direction, and the length of the waggle would be translated into distance. Now that can be variable, which I'll show on another slide, but generally, in average conditions, it relates to 1 second is about 1 kilometer. You might hear a little ball rolling in the background, and that's our cat who's playing with a ball with a noise in it. Sorry about that. Right. So the dance gives the directions, precise in inverted commas, directions and distance, because it's not that precise, but the bees seem to manage with it. Okay. Now, again, just to show the different types. So here, there's the beehive, there's foraging site 1. It is directly away from the sun. So the bee will dance down the comb, around, down, around, down, and keep going. And she will dance many times, and depends on how good she considers that the forage is, to encourage more bees to follow and to go out. So 80 degrees to forage site 2, 80 degrees to the left, so they'll be dancing across the comb like so, up, round and back, and then towards the sun will be going directly up the comb. So up and down, they would be much more accurate, because when they're dancing across the comb, they've got gravity against them, so they do tend, I mean, there was a paper from Maggie Coubillon in Sussex showing that the bees get tired and they do slightly move down because of gravity when they're going across the comb, either way. They obviously see polarized light. Now, Fish found this out because on a cloudy day, he went to the observation hive thinking, oh, not going to be doing any analysis today because it's cloudy. And then he noticed the bees were dancing. And so he came to the conclusion, obviously, they could see polarized light, and therefore they continued to dance. In Sussex University, I'm going to talk about that later. They did a massive exercise over 2 years to analyze the dances on 3 observation hives, an hour recording each day, and they did over 5,000 dances, plotted it on a map, and showed during the season, each month, where the bees were actually foraging in relation to the university. And they, because of the inaccuracy of the waggle and the fact that it moved, they would always take 6 readings, ignore the first and the last, and then take an average of the 4, because that's what they reckon the bees were doing. So they're averaging it out as well. And the first one was always a sort of a little bit out, and last ones they get tired. So we'll do that. Are we all right? So an even number of dances to get round the bias. So this is.
Honeybees have some fascinating abilities, among them being able to communicate by performing a unique dance. It informs hive mates where a newly discovered food source is located. Every cycle of this waggle dance roughly describes the shape of the figure 8. Let's rewind and look in more detail. The bee only waggles on a part of its route, the straight run, indicated here by the waved line. The secret lies in the direction of the straight run, or to be more precise, in the angle between the straight run and the perpendicular, which in this case is 90 degrees to the left. This tells the other bees that food is available 90 degrees to the left of the sun. If the angle is 60 degrees to the right, they'll be flying 60 degrees to the right of the sun.
That's Francis Rapnick's Professor of Apiculture in Sussex University. So, short video which explains it really rather nicely. Now, how do bees judge distances? This is an interesting one because we've got here, this is a photograph taken from the Buzzerbank bees, although the research was not done by Jürgen Tautz. We have it's worked out, I mean, lots of people thought, is it the amount of fuel that they use when they're flying, or is it the optical flow passing their eyes as they fly through the countryside? And this very elegant exercise was carried out with the black and white boxes in a tube which is about 6 meters long. The distance from the hive to the source of food, 6 meters. So the bee flies through there, goes back to the hive, and actually dances as though she has traveled 180 meters because of the massive amount of activity that's gone past as she's flying through. And the followers actually went out approximately 180 meters, and obviously there was nothing there, and they returned to the hive. They also, as part of the experiment, they also discovered that the bees will use the green receptor in the bee's eyes to actually measure this by changing the different colors. And then in the example here, where the bee is flying over what I call a green desert, because it's featureless, she dances a very short dance. But when she dances over a typical area with trees and hedges and maybe a road, maybe a river and green fields, the dance is much, much longer. But because the bees are going on the same terrain, they can interpret that correctly, even though it's showing different distances according to the terrain. So let's have a look at the evolution of the dance, because this is very interesting. This is there are 9 species of the genus Apis and 3 groups. And there is a progression in the complexity of the dance. It's regarded that the dwarf bees are the original type of bee. It's difficult to understand because of the huge difference in size and their foraging habits. But we've got Apis florea and Andreniformis that have nests that are basically on a twig. They have single frame, single comb, but they have a dance floor in red there on the top of the twig. Then the giant bees, Laboriosa and Dorsata, have this one very, very large comb, and they dance vertically on it, but partly in the open and partly beneath bees. Depends how many bees are on the cone. So they dance in the same way that our bees do. They use gravity for the direction of the sun. Then we got five cavity bees, and of these 9 bees, by the way, 5 of them live on Borneo of these species. So in here we've got Apis mellifera and we've got Apis cerana, the bees we know particularly, and they've evolved because they live in the dark and they've got vertical combs, and so they do it exactly the same way as the giant bees, but obviously in the dark. So there are variations because of the fact that they do it in the dark. So Apis florea and Andreniformis, the dwarf bees, they have this dance floor, but they take off in the direction of the food, straight off. It's as though they're having a run at it. It's like a takeoff. And there's a bee there actually preparing to go and lifting up her abdomen, very much like our bees do to expose the nasonoth gland. But that's what she's doing. She's showing the other bees where the direction of the food is, right? And when an experiment was done to stop them dancing on the horizontal surface and put them on the vertical surface, they did the same thing. They didn't revert to dancing on the as our bees do, using gravity. They actually still went in the direction. They tried as best they could to go in the direction of the food. So with the giant bees, there are differences between dorsata, the one that hangs on the tree, because they have huge number. Sometimes they're 3 deep on the cone. They also can forage at night. At full moon, they forage at night. Therefore, they need gravity because they could be in the dark or below bees, and they use auditory signals, the same as the cavity bees, by moving their wings. Laboriosa, which are on the cliffs, more on the cliffs, they only forage in the day. They use gravity, that's exactly the same, but they have no auditory signals because they can see the dance and they don't need the auditory signal. And so why is there a sound? Basically, it's the cavity nesting species produce the sounds, where we've got mellifera here and we've got cerana. They're making a very similar noise during the waggle run. It's basically because it's in the dark, and therefore by making the noise, more bees can actually pick up the direction and the length of the waggle by the sound. So they're picking that up with their antennae, which is much more sensitive and can actually get to more bees. The dwarf bee does, however, emit a burst or two, but only during the actual return, the semicircular run. They don't make a sound during the waggle dance, the waggle part of it, because they don't need to. And then the wings are held in different ways. Our bees hold them very much tucked under, only slightly spread. They make a sound, but the big difference is with the dwarf bees, because they need to be seen, they actually lift up the abdomen right up in the air like so. They waggle it from side to side and also vibrate it up and down. And their wings are spread wide, and then because they're not actually making the sound there. So then we come to Martin Lindau, who was described by Tom Seeley as the bee observer extraordinaire. He specialized in behavioral physiology and experimental sociobiology, which basically means he observed the bees and recorded the details. And he was a very bright student who did well in his school and ended up unfortunately in the army, but he was wounded, and that was fortunate because he was invalided out, and the company that he was originally in were decimated, and only 3 of them survived at the Battle of Stalingrad. So he survived and he recuperated in Munich. And while he was there, he happened to go to, because he'd never studied biology, he never did science in school, but he went to a lecture by von Frisch, and that basically changed his life. And his PhD thesis is interesting because it was on the effects of food scent and taste on the release of the dances. But in his long career, he researched 3 major projects, which actually have been followed up by many scientists over the years. And the big one is division of labor in honeybee colonies, water economy and temperature regulation in bee colonies, and house hunting by honeybee swarms. And most of these have been followed up, especially by Tom Seeley, in his subsequent research. Picture of him with von Frisch and the whole team in 1951. And eventually, after he got his degree at the university, von Frisch took him on as a PhD student. This is an example from looking at the age-based activities as the development of the glands take place. This is observation of B107 from, excuse me, I'll just move the cat, which is just going to walk across the screen, which would have been interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. That's all right. So he was the first to map out the life of a bee and measure all its activities. This chart on the left is at 8 days old for a day in the life of B107, showing that it was resting and patrolling, it was eating pollen, it was cell cleaning, it was tending brood, young and old, it was building comb, and it was capping comb as well. Now, the chart on the right shows the activity over 177 hours of observation. And 70 hours were sitting around and 56 hours on inspection tours. And this is believed, obviously, their reserves. Their reserves for temperature control. Their reserves for storing nectar when there's a sudden flow on. And also, they are a reserve as a backup to the guards, because there aren't that many guard bees in a colony. And if they are under attack, there are bees that are quite mature. They don't forage, but they are able to defend the colony. And a paper released, which I read recently, which shows you can analyze them. You can work, you know that how old they are because you've marked them, but you can tell by how ragged or not their wings are. Because foragers, when they've been out a lot, their wings get very ragged. But these bees of the same age have perfect wings. So they are in the colony as a backup. And these things were discovered just by observation, just with paper and pencil. This is, you know, the man that did this, it was a fantastic piece of research. And then in his paper, House Hunting by Honeybee Swarms, is one of the few papers that have been translated into English. He describes how he discovered that bees on the face of a swarm were actually performing a waggle dance. He got permission to use real swarms. They didn't do much swarm control, in their observation hive. So a swarm would come out, would go in the tree as we classically know it. And then Linda was actually observing that and recording the dances actually on the face of the swarm. And he noticed several things that were different from the bees that danced in the observation hive. For instance, there were no pollen loads, and he thought they weren't bringing pollen in because, sorry, bringing nectar in because they weren't offering it to other bees. They weren't stretching the proboscis out to other bees, and they performed much longer and more persistent dances because they were advertising the potential home. And they were covered in detritus. Remember, this is bomb-damaged Munich, where you've got dust and open chimneys, unused chimneys, ideal places for swarms to gather. And so he noticed this and he checked it out on, with his microscope and realized that they were not foraging, they were doing something else. And he realized that they were performing dances for a home, a new location. And the picture on the right is, this is why the university was bombed, because you've got the central railway station in Munich, and these are 4 of the ones that he traced. He traced 19 altogether, and he realized that as the swarm goes through the whole process, they don't leave until they've agreed on the site that they want to go to. And they'll spend days doing this, even in bad weather. They will wait, and because they're not flying, they're protecting themselves, but they will wait. It's a great exercise in democracy, and waiting until they've got a consensus before they actually move. So he actually got so good at this, and he, on 5 occasions, he actually followed swarms to their destination, and he was able to forecast when they were planning to fly, and sometimes he would arrive at the destination before they did. And you can imagine him running through bomb-torn streets of Munich, actually trying to get to a swarm site before the bees did. And he did that. And this is one of them, where they started on June the 26th, cloudy, cool. It was rainy on the 28th and the 29th. As soon as the sky cleared, there was a lot more activity, but you can see how many sites they're advertising. The one site that they finally chose, this one here, there was 7 bees at that point actually dancing for it. 7, then it goes up to 22, but you can see there are still a large number of dances for other locations, some much further away. This one was quite close, this site. And then gradually the others decline. This one here, there's only a couple left. There are 2 left on the day they leave, but as soon as they stop dancing, they leave. About 300 meters away, and they were up in that little hole there on that bomb-damaged building. They went in there. On this one, not going to go through a lot of these, but this is an interesting one. It's a linden swarm, because he named all his swarms, and it broke up. It went through a square, and the station square, and it was scattered. The swarm was scattered by the traffic, and it formed a new cluster, and the dancing resumed. But you'll see that when they danced just before they left, that's the distance, which was about 800 meters. They then flew 500 meters, and now they only dance for the remainder. They dance for 300 meters, same direction, obviously, but they actually calculated how far they'd gone and just danced for the remainder. Now we come to Tom Seeley, professor at Cornell. I'm sure you're all very familiar with him. He's spoken in this country many times. For his PhD, he picked up Lindauer's investigations, plus the work on superorganism. Basically, it was 20 years since Lindauer had published, and no one had done any further research. Now, scientists all over the world are studying it, but it was the second chapter of Lindauer's book that inspired him, the communication among social bees, and it's the chapter is called Communication by Dancing in Swarm Bees. And that's what influenced him. And you can see here, and on the next slide, he sets up, Tom Seeley actually sets up the process on, it's a set-up swarm. The queen is in a cage. They're fed. About 4,000 bees are actually shaken onto the screen. We've got a video camera, and all the bees now are marked with colored discs, colored numbered discs. So it makes it so much easier and more accurate, and the whole job a lot easier than trying to record it on pencil and paper just by looking, which is what Martin Lindauer did. So he comes up with much prettier slides, basically, done in 97, Seeley and Bormann, but that's exactly the same principle. This was done over a shorter period of time, and he's now able to identify exactly how many bees, how many dances, and there is a competition basically between G and B all the way through, although there are still, right to the end, there's still 3 others right at the end here, or 3 before they decide, and then the whole volume of it between 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock. You've got 73 bees doing 352 dances. That's it, and off they go. So it's the same principle, but it's easier to read, and there's more detail in there because he's able to do that. It's been used. This was work done by Fishy and Seeley, Ratniks back in 2000, published work that was analyzed in 96. And this was about the furthest that bees have been recorded actually flying to forage. This was when Francis Ratniks was at Sheffield University. And they were flying due west from Sheffield to heather on the Derbyshire moors in the middle of August. And these bees then were identified and marked in on the heather by undergraduates. And the furthest they flew was 14.4 kilometers, which is 9 miles. And they'd obviously have to, before they leave, they have to make sure they've got enough nectar in their crop to get them a distance across, especially if they're going against the wind on the way out. But you can identify, using these maps, you can identify exactly where the bees are going to. In May, for instance, they're not flying any distance at all, because there's more forage in Sheffield itself, in the parks and the gardens and so on. Interesting experiment here to show this is done with using harmonic radar, which at the time did have a problem in that if they go behind hedges or behind trees, so the distance is not great. They can't map them out for too far, but they train bees from the hive to a feeder, and many of them don't actually make it. That was the interesting thing. Because of the trail, a lot of them actually don't get to the feeder. But what they then did was take them when they captured them when they went back to the hive, and actually released them in different places about 250 meters away from the hive to see what they would do. and they flew in the same direction as they were trained to do to the feeder from each point. When they found there was nothing there, they actually went back into the hive. But it shows how they have been trained, they know which way to go, the right direction, and the pattern on here looks very similar when it's moved away. So this is the work that was done in the Laboratory of Apiculture and Social Insects, LASSI, in Sussex University. That's Francis Ratnick's and Maggie Couvillon, postdoc. At the time, we went down and spent a day down there when they had one of their open days, and we were able to actually do some analysis and the way that they were doing it. She got a lot of undergraduates to do the work, so because it was over 5,000 waggle dances they analysed. But basically, they were asking the question: what practical use can we make out of doing an analysis of a waggle dance? They had 3 observation hives up, and they videoed them for 1 hour every day during the season, and recorded it during the months of the year, so that you've got the distance. This represents the distance that they were flying. So in August they're flying just over an average of about 2.5 kilometers. When you're in March, very little flying. Maybe the weather's not so good, but they've got forage very close. April and May, there's probably oilseed rape very close. July, again, they don't have anything very close. They don't have, because of the downs, there seemed to be a problem in those months of July and August particularly. And of course, in October, they don't go very far. We've got the ivy coming in here. So they did this across 2 years to show the pattern. And then they mapped it crudely at first, just showing what their interpretation was of the distance and direction and then they coded the months. So in August, I've lost my mouse. Come on, here it is. Right. So in August we're on the outliers here, the blue ones, and the red ones for September. We've also got the outliers, and they showed this then on a cluster analysis, which shows it much more clearly. The black circles are 3 and 5 kilometers apart, and it's a typical landscape, a mixture of urban and rural areas. And it shows a spread and changes in foraging patterns over the season and in which months there is a dearth in foraging. She subsequently married this guy here because he did all the maths for her, because she's not very good at that. She was very good at analysing the dances, but not so good on the math side of it. And I know he produced these cluster analysis, which is quite interesting to show. We're showing that in summer how far the bees are going to search. Same in October. In March, they're very, very close into the centre of Brighton and the area around. Again, in summer, they're going out, although they've got hot spots. That's the point. So they also analysed the sugar content. Here, obviously, you can see the effect of oilseed rape here, high sugar content, and then we get to in September and October, we've got the ivy, also high sugar content. So you can see that from the difference where the quality of the sugar is in their forage. And the conclusions for basic science out of their program was how the foraging distance and habitat changes seasonally, determined by flower availability, of course. In the summer, they were ranging just over 15 square kilometers. In the spring, only 0.8, and in the autumn, 5.1 kilometers. So they're foraging huge distances, and they're making the benefit of both urban and rural landscape. And a high percentage, when you look at the spread, was what I call green deserts, because you've got the downs where they've been a lot of sheep on them, and there's very few flowers on them anymore. So they don't get, in that area, there's a big gap in the areas. But it demonstrates the importance of flower. They showed up the research, a huge amount of research into the waggle dance using modern techniques. It gave evidence of the need for promotion for urban gardens, local parks, so they could go to the council and show them there's pressure to be put to show them the benefit of having urban parks, because at certain times of the year the bees were short of forage, and it gave evidence of the benefits of planting the most suitable plants for honeybees. So it was an interesting exercise, also done in conjunction with looking at particular types of forage as well, in analyzing pollen. So that's the end of my talk, and that's the sources that I used for it. It's really a glance at it because it's a huge, huge subject. And thank you for your